Hello, friends. As I glide along the Nile in this canoe, I can't help but think, without this river, there would be no Egypt. The towering pyramids, the mighty pharaohs, the temples, the golden treasures, all of it existed because of this one life-giving river. The Nile wasn't just important to the Egyptians, it was everything. Imagine looking around ancient Egypt. On one side, you have the lush green fields filled with crops, people working, birds singing, and on the other side, endless desert. Without the Nile, Egypt would have been nothing more than a dry, barren wasteland. But every year, like clockwork, the river flooded, bringing fresh, fertile soil that made farming possible. And this, my friends, is why Egypt became one of the greatest civilizations in history. Now, the ancient Egyptians weren't just sitting around hoping for rain. They studied the Nile like their lives depended on it. Because, well, they did. They noticed a pattern. Every year, the river rose in July, peaked in September, and receded by October. This wasn't a random event. The flooding was caused by rains in Ethiopia, where the Blue Nile begins, and when those waters reached Egypt, they carried rich black silt that made the soil perfect for growing crops. And the Egyptians had a name for this blessing: Hapi, the god of the Nile. They believed he was responsible for the floods, and trust me, they worshipped him a lot. After all, a good flood meant food, prosperity, and happy pharaohs. A bad flood? Famine, chaos, and very unhappy pharaohs. But they didn't just rely on Hapi's generosity. They built canals, dikes, and reservoirs to control the water and make sure it reached their fields. This was one of the first examples of organized irrigation in human history. They divided the year into 3 seasons based on the Nile. Akhet, flooding season. When the fields were underwater, people worked on construction projects like temples and pyramids. Peret, growing season. When the water receded, farmers planted wheat, barley, flax, and vegetables. Shimu, harvest season. When the crops were ready, farmers cut them down before the scorching summer heat arrived. And let me tell you, farming in ancient Egypt was no joke. There were no fancy tractors, no fertilizers, no modern irrigation systems. It was all done by hand, using wooden plows, oxen, and simple tools. And yet, they produced so much food that Egypt became known as the breadbasket of the ancient world. Wheat and barley were the main crops, used for making bread and beer, the 2 staples of the Egyptian diet. Yes, beer. The Egyptians loved their beer, and it wasn't just for fun. It was safer to drink than water in many cases. And even kids had it, though it was much weaker than today's beer. But agriculture wasn't just about food. Flax was grown to make linen for clothing. Papyrus was used for making paper, baskets, and even boats. And let's not forget livestock. Cows, goats, and sheep were essential for milk, meat, and religious sacrifices. The Nile wasn't just the source of Egypt's wealth, it was also its highway. Boats carried goods up and down the river, making trade easier. Fishermen caught catfish and tilapia, and hunters along the riverbanks caught hippos and crocodiles. Though I wouldn't want to be the guy assigned to that job. So, with a river that gave life, a farming system that ensured food, and trade that brought wealth, you'd think Egypt would always be stable, right? Well, not exactly. Because while the Nile could bring prosperity, it could also bring disaster. Too much flooding, crops drowned, and people starved. Too little flooding, the land dried up and people starved. And when famine hit, people started questioning their rulers. And that, my friends, is where Egypt's first golden age started to crack. Join me next time as we unravel the story of the rise and fall of the Old Kingdom, a time when mighty pharaohs learned that not even they could control nature or the will of the people.